I feel so countercultural sometimes because I don't really fall into the Christian world or into the rabbinic world. I mean, for example, there is a commandment in the highest book of Jewish law, which goes something like this. If your friend hands you a tallit to borrow from him, and he doesn't have any fringes on it, then you're exempt from the commandment to wear fringes for about 30 days, which means you have time to get access to fringes. But here's the thing, the spirit of that rabbinic commandment goes directly against the Torah. Why? Because the Torah explicitly states that the commandment to wear fringes is an everlasting ordinance. And if an everlasting ordinance can be put on pause for 30 days, is it really an everlasting ordinance? Well, Jesus was countercultural too, and so were his parents. Can you imagine being Yehoseph and Miriam, that's Joseph and Mary in the English language, and being told by the angel sent from Yehovah himself, that essentially you shall name your son Yehoshua? And Jewish tradition, even dating back to the first century, goes something like this. You name your child during the ceremony of Brit Milah, that is on the 8th day when he is circumcised. And the reality is, well, if they were told months prior to him even being born, you shall name him Yehoshua, then that requires obedience against the culture. So for us, when we're instructed to do things in the Bible that are countercultural, are we going to obey what Elohim says, or are we going to fall into wanting to be popular with men? And you know how often I hear it from Orthodox Jews that I'm not wearing my tassels correctly if I don't have them on a talit katan? So many times. And if that's the case, then that means Jews and Israelites all the way up to the 15th century were violating that commandment, because the talit katan, which is essentially a short garment that has the fringes on them, was not invented until the 15th century. So that means Yeshua did it wrong, the apostles did it wrong, the first century Jews did it wrong, the Pharisees did it wrong, they all did it wrong. In fact, what's actually true is when we look in the book of Matthew, it says that Yeshua wore a cloak. So a Jew back in the first century would have worn a cloak that would have tassels on it. Essentially, this would be an all-day, everyday garment. This wouldn't just be like a prayer shawl that you throw on during a synagogue or Shabbat service. What this would be is you would be dragging around the tzitzits almost to the point where they were close to touching the floor. And this is why when the woman who had a flow of blood touched Yeshua's garment, she touched the hem. She said, if only I could touch the hem. It's almost like she dove face down towards the ground just to grab it. She had to actually go low to touch it. She wasn't at his waist. She was at his ankles. But you know, in Messianic, a lot of people, they're just like, let's just do whatever the rabbis say. And you know, how's that gonna fly? Because I've even realized, without even realizing it, that I've had a lot of rabbinic thinking instilled in me that wasn't really in Torah or Tanakh. And that's because I was attempting to study it, and I needed help to actually learn how to interpret it and how to get through it, because it's a difficult document, right? But I've had a lot of wrestling throughout the years, and have come to various conclusions. And if you look even at their eschatological point of view, they think that prophecy has ceased since Malachi spoke. And how does that bode well with Joel chapter 2, when Elohim says in the latter days, meaning in the very end days, he will cause sons and daughters to act in the office of prophecy? How does that happen? If prophecy ceases at Malachi, how can it be true that in the very last days, which clearly haven't happened yet if we're not at the Messianic age, that sons and daughters engage in prophesying? And some might say, well, we're talking about the typical chain of prophecy, and universal prophecy will resume during the Messianic age. But here's the thing, we need prophets before the Messianic age, because what does the Tanakh say? That Elohim sends his prophets to warn the people before he acts. How can Elohim reign in the Messianic age unless he's warned his people that it's coming and they need to repent? Primarily through a prophet. And this is where the deception comes in, my friends. In Revelation 13, so this is an eschatological viewpoint already, we read about the beast rising out of the sea, and the sea is representative of masses of people. So the beast will come out of an area that's heavily populated, or we might call the earth by then heavily populated, given the trajectory of how many people are having children, particularly immigrants to first world countries. And then the second thing it talks about is the false prophet rains down fire from heaven. This is Eliyahu or Elijah type language. Now in the Tanakh, we know that Elijah rained down fire from heaven. And we know that in Judaism, they're expecting Eliyahu to come in and herald in the Messianic age. And here's where this gets interesting. It will be, more than likely, the Jews who think that as this false Mashiach comes to power, that the man raining down fire from heaven for him is Eliyahu. And this is what plays into the ritual where they actually save a seat for Eliyahu at the Pesach or the Passover. It's my belief that the Great Tribulation will begin on a Passover or during the Passover season or during the Passover time, because the context of the Pesach is to flee Egypt, it's to flee trouble, it's to flee being pursued to death. And also the Pesach commands that we eat in haste and we eat standing up with our loins girded up. So if you think about it, the Jews save a seat for Elijah at Pesach. This is where the false prophet comes in. Oh yes, this is the man we've saved our seat for. And then the false Mashiach comes in and he pretends to act in the Ben David role. He restores temple worship. He brings back the exiles. War effectively seems over because he brings in a false sense of peace in the world. And effectively people think, wow, this is it. This is the man. This is the guy. And then Christians might look at it through a different lens, but they'll still fall under the same deception that causes them to take the mark. They might think, oh, this prophet is the next Kim Clement. Kim Clement was right about so many things, particularly in the political, or what we might call the geopolitical landscape. And then they'll look at the anti-Mashiach or the false Christ, so to speak, as somebody who is very powerful. Miracles get performed for him. And under the threat of death, we're not orthodox. We're not zealous enough for Yeshua, so to speak. And we're not doing the things that he commands. So it's easy to fall for that deception. And this is where the Matthew 24 prophecy comes in. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Effectively, in times past, the Pesach represented a time of needing to flee. And it will once again. Yeshua says to pray that your flight be not in the winter or on a Shabbat. Well, what's interesting about that statement is that the Pesach tends to happen during the winter. So he's already letting you know the season of the Great Tribulation will happen during the biblical time of winter. At least this is when it will commence, and therefore when you need to be on the lookout for it. And then I believe Yeshua will return around the time of the Feast of Trumpets, which makes this all the more interesting because if the Great Tribulation starts during a Pesach, which we have a hint at in Matthew 24, and it also makes sense because as the Ramban points out, the prophecies are cyclical. Whatever happened to our forefathers or the patriarchs is also bound to happen to later generations of the children of Israel. So if it starts in Pesach and then ends 3 years later during the Feast of Trumpets, what we have is 42 months. And one of the rabbinic commandments during the Feast of Trumpets is that if it happens to land during a Shabbat, you don't bring your shofar with you or carry it to synagogue because it counts as a burden. Unless you have a ruv, you cannot do that. You're not authorized to because according to their interpretation of Jeremiah, that's how that would work. But really, you're going to mandate that people don't carry their shofars even though on that specific day it's commanded for them to blow it? So this goes along with Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25. The Antichrist, the anti-Mashiach, or even like Mashiach figure, this guy's going to pretend that he's the Mashiach, will speak pompous things against the Most High and seek not necessarily to do away with his times and laws, but to change them. So he didn't do away with the Feast of Trumpets, but he might have said, hey, don't bring your shofar on the Feast of Trumpets because it's a burden that's too heavy to carry.